Hi everyone, a very good afternoon, and let me start by thanking the organizers for putting together this conference. I think it's an extremely important set of themes that we're exploring, particularly given the events of the last week and how they have illustrated the turbulence and complexity as well as interdependence of the world that we live in. What I'd like to do today is share some insights that the Singapore government has gleaned over the years in applying scenario planning as well as other futures tools in our broader government strategic planning process. I was very privileged to be part of a small team that began our Center for Strategic Futures back in 2010. Now that's a small internal unit, a bit like a think tank, but a bit like an office as well. And we bring together the functions of planning for the future and helping our government to question the deep assumptions that it is making about the broader world. I'll share 5 key ideas in this video, and I look forward very much to any feedback or comments that you might have, either shared with me through social media or over email. The first insight that I'd like to share is about what the core purpose of foresight actually is. There's often a temptation to believe that the core reason we do foresight is to predict the future, to somehow get what might happen in the future correct. And that might mean we need to predict who a leader might end up being in a country, or how the global order might end up evolving, or how national identities might look in the long-range time frame. The core reason that we do this work, actually, though, is not prediction. It's about making better decisions today. And we use stories of the future, whether we call them scenarios or desired and preferred futures. We use all of these as tools to question our deep assumptions about the here and now. And in doing that, we can ask ourselves what assumptions might go wrong, and therefore how can we refine our understanding of the world as well as the lenses through which we view the events in that world. Now this is quite key because once we understand that the core purpose is not to predict but to actually understand our decisions today in a more sophisticated way, then we realize that actually most scenarios might never come true, or that the real future might be more complex than any scenario we put out there. But what we need to do then is to take the insights of those complexities, look at what those stories might teach us about ourselves and how we perceive the world, and then make more sophisticated and hopefully more insightful decisions about the here and now and the decisions that we're making today. The second insight that I'd like to share is that futures work often involves a certain amount of discomfort and organizational friction. And I'll tell you what I mean by this. I mentioned earlier that futures work often involves re-examining the deep mental models and assumptions that we have about the world. Now, any process of re-examining these things, these deep assumptions that we might hold core to our very beliefs, is going to involve a certain amount of self-examination and often a certain amount of resistance on our part. It can also involve resistance amongst others in our organization because what we are actually doing is questioning the deep, cherished beliefs that they might possess. Things that have always worked in the past which might not work in the future may not always be easy for them to accept because it involves new ways of dealing with things, new ways of processing information, as well as new ways of actually understanding the ways in which they think. This is never an easy process for anyone, and in particular in organizations which have been successful over time. That kind of process of self-reflection will, I think, invariably involve a certain amount of pain and a certain amount of friction. Futurists therefore need to make sure that they are, first of all, ready for that and willing to deal with the long-range process of persuasion, coaxing, and cajoling that is invariably required to shift those deep mental models. Let's move on to insight number 3, and this is the importance of diversity in the perspectives and networks that we tap into. Now this goes back again to the idea that we are involved in the business of re-examining our deep mental models and assumptions. And we can't do that by ourselves because by definition we won't know what we don't know. What we therefore need is a huge, diverse network of people who can help us to challenge our mental models, who can introduce us to new ways of seeing, who can help us to understand that there are different perspectives which we can take, and that in that process help us to understand a much broader diversity of perspectives. Pierre Wacht, the great scenario planner from Shell, actually said that scenarios are a process of reperceiving. He called it the gentle art of reperceiving. And in order for this reperceiving to happen, we actually need diverse networks. For us in government, that may mean talking to people in the social sector. It may mean talking to people in business. It means talking to academics in emerging fields that don't fit into the neat compartments and categories of how we currently view the world. But we need to do that in order to constantly challenge ourselves and bring new ideas to the fore. Let me move on now to the fourth insight. And this is really the idea that in trying to persuade people to move beyond the old mental models and assumptions they might have had, we need to employ deeply immersive measures. And again, let me explain what I mean by this. We could, as many futures outfits used to do, simply produce reports, long 100-page documents that outline the deep analysis we've put in and all the trends that we think are going to change. But that's not going to be enough, because analysis alone cannot persuade people to shift the deep assumptions and mental models that they possess. What we found is actually quite useful in this process is to help people put themselves into the future in a simulated way and in a safe way. Now, this can mean a few things. It can mean designing videos of what that future might look like. It might mean to use the work of experiential futurists like Stuart Candy from Australia, but who now works in Canada. It might mean putting them into immersive experiences, walking through a museum of the future, for instance, and asking ourselves what might become redundant by a particular time frame, like 2050. It might mean asking ourselves what a schoolroom or a hospital or a government building of the future might look like. It might involve asking ourselves what will phones and computers, if indeed they exist, look like in the future. And once we go through that sort of deep, physical, visceral immersion, what we find is that the future is actually much easier to imagine. And once that imagination can happen, then the deep mental models and assumptions can actually start to shift. But analytically by itself, the process will not work. We need to supplement the analysis with a more emotional, psychological, and broader experiential curation. This all leads me to insight number 5, which really brings all of the ideas together. And this is the fact that we need to use a designer's mindset when doing good futures work. Now, what do I mean by that? Designers are by nature user-focused and user-centric. They are interested in the end user of their product and how they are going to experience the product that they put out. And this is quite core in good futures work, because we need to keep the specific decision makers in mind that we are trying to persuade to change their mental models. Because of the difficulty of the whole process, we need to cater to each salient and germane aspect of that psychological makeup. That may mean that if we know a particular decision maker deals better with numbers than with words, then we need to provide simulated numbers that help them to understand the deep data that drives the beliefs that we're trying to help them change. If we know that some are more visual or more experiential, then we need to give them that sort of experience to help make our ideas more credible. If we know that others might be more persuaded in a long-term way rather than in quick, short bursts, then we need to be able to give them that kind of experience as well. Now, this means that good foresight practitioners must deeply understand the organization that they are part of. They cannot simply provide generic analysis and expect it to somehow stick. They have to find ways of crafting, of curating, and of changing and adapting their material to meet the different needs of different decision makers. And that, I think, is quite core in the overall designer's toolkit. What I've gone through are just 5 very broad ideas and insights that we have found to be helpful in the futures process. Each process is, of course, unique, and each time we do a new futures project, we find new insights. But these we found are quite generic across the different types of projects that we've ended up doing. And what I hope to have done today is to help others to learn these things in advance so that you can make new errors, new mistakes, and new experiments that you can learn from and that hopefully you can help others to learn from as well.